We're going to be learning about a little bit about trauma and what kids are dealing with. So
Yeah, very good. In town here, I've worked at Pine Rest, Metropolitan Hospital. My wife and I started adoption and foster care about 20-some years ago. We've adopted 9 kids. We probably had around 30 come through at different points in the past 20 years. All of our kids, 2 were private adoptions, but they were kind of crisis pregnancies. The rest came from the adoption and foster care system. So there's a level of trauma to varying degrees, from first-degree criminal sexual abuse, that kind of thing, all the way to neglect and things like that. Just a couple things to start out with. I'm aware that probably in a group this size, somewhere around 20 to 25% of women don't make it to their 18th birthday without experiencing physical or sexual abuse. I'm going to try and stay general as I talk about it. It's probably around, 30% for men and 20 to 25% for 30% for women, 20 to 25% for men. So if you need to step out at any point, we'll just assume you're going to the bathroom. There's not a problem that way. I'm going to try and stay general. But to make it effective, I want to answer questions and give you real life scenarios too. So I'll try to walk that balance a little bit on that. I also want to say, especially to brothers and sisters of color, as I discuss this, I want you to know up front that I'm a trauma survivor, had some physical and sexual abuse that I came through as a kid, but I don't pretend that my experience is the same as a young African-American girl that's living in Southeast Grand Rapids and dealing with that. I had resources and privilege that she didn't have, so I want to recognize that. I think that's really important to say that. The tool that I wanted to take a look at, just as a talking point to give you a little bit of flavor as we flesh this out, is called the Adverse Childhood Experience Rating Scale. And you can kind of go through this yourself. And as I talk about that, what's interesting is there's pain everywhere. I've worked with billionaires right to homeless, people. Both my parents were college graduates. Both experienced mental illness. So it's important to realize it's not just one demographic or group of people that struggles with trauma. It's experienced everywhere, and there's probably people that have come through that here. So I want to take a look at this. If you want to just go along, it's just a real brief, just 10 questions, okay? Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? No, or if yes, enter 1. That was the situation that I was in. Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? If yes, enter 1. It's either 0 or 1 as you go through this. Did an adult or a person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touched their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? No, or if yes, enter 1. Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? I would mark 1 on that myself. Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you, or to take you to the doctor if you needed it? Sometimes that was the case too. It kind of covers, actual abuse and neglect in this. Were your parents ever separated or divorced? My parents just celebrated 50 years, interestingly. Was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes often or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something, or ever repeatedly hit, or at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun? It kind of covers domestic violence. Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic, or used street drugs? What's interesting too, sometimes bipolar illness If you've got a parent that deals with that, it's similar to what an alcoholic or addicted parent did. Some of the patterns, walking on eggshells, unpredictability, there's some parallels that way. Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? I would mark 1 on that. Did a household member go to prison? Fortunately, I could say no on that kind of a situation. This is important, so you can kind of take a look at your score. Most of the kids that you're working with, they're going to have 4 is really a critical cutoff. Their life outcomes in terms of job prospects, economic achievement, physical and emotional health, if they're at a 4, they're at significant disadvantages. If you even scored 1 on those 10 measures, your mental health, your physical outcomes are significantly impacted, but 4 is a critical situation there. Also, this is just really a concise sort of a thing. It's sometimes with adult survivors that I work with, if someone is kind of frozen up and they're having a hard time talking about it, we'll kind of go through this as I start, doing therapy with people, just as a jumping off point and working through that. It's a way for them to, if they minimize or discount what they're going through, and I think, boy, trauma is impacting your relationships and your adult functioning. This is a good talking point that way. This kind of gives you a point of reference that way. This doesn't capture everything. There's boys and girls that walk home that are bullied, they're targeted, they're robbed. I was talking to a female client of mine. She said, I walked to school. She grew up in a tougher part of Detroit. And from the time she was 12 all the way through high school, Johns would proposition her as she was walking to school every day. I got driven a lot of places, you know what I mean? I didn't have to walk too much, or I rode my bike, or I was in a small town or things like that. These kids have to walk everywhere, and sometimes they're targeted for physical violence or proposition by Johns, or those kinds of things. I worked with a psychiatrist at Pine Rest for a number of years, and she always made the point. There was a serial rapist that were picking up girls. She worked went to school at Cass Tech, and she was walking through the neighborhoods, and she said to me, Tim, if those girls, this was happening in Grosse Pointe or someplace East Grand Rapids, they would call out they'd have the state police and the National Guard here escorting those girls to school, but because they're poor black girls, it's handled differently. And I thought that was a powerful statement there. So wanted to make a distinction. For most of us, our life experience is different that way. They're dealing with things that are really tough. Again, I'm not a person of color, so it's different for me, and I had more resources to deal with that kind of a thing. But I want to give you a couple scenarios. If a young girl tells you she's been cutting, you build a relationship with your mentee, and she tells you she's been cutting, and let's say, there's a difference here, there's a distinction. The way she's cutting, she's going like this. Their lateral cuts this way, and their lateral cuts this way. How would you want to address that? You kind of build a relationship, you're safe enough, or you even notice it. Maybe she's at summertime and she's got her shorts on, and that's happening or whatever, or you're changing into a swimsuit to do an activity. So you want to give a shot how they might, hey, I noticed this.
Are you making a reference to lateral instead of vertical cuts?
Yeah, you know that distinction.
I know that distinction as
Yeah.
well, but I really wouldn't come directly onto that. I would just offer myself as, somebody you can come to just in case, but I just wouldn't be like, hey, I noticed this. Because sometimes when you approach people and things like that, they actually reject you.
Yeah, it's great too. And body awareness, you might give female peer or a female staff, if it's a girl, a heads up, hey, I noticed that, because that could make that dynamic a little strange. But yeah, Drake, you got something, man? Or you got
If you already are their mentee and like they're bringing this information to you, like I would believe that they already know that you're going to be there for them for everything. But in that scenario, it's harmful to them. So you have to take that to a higher up, whether that be like Donnie or some, like it's not in your position to help those kids. Like, yes, you can show them
okay.
that you're there, but I believe like you want to seek out more help in that situation.
In the situations that I haven't had a kid cut himself, but I've had friends that cut themselves, and with the girls, when they cut themselves sideways, you can't figure it out just from a cut, but if they're cutting sideways down their legs, a lot of times they'll post it on Instagram. If they're cutting straight up, they're wanting to die.
Yeah.
If they're going side to side, a lot of times it is for who knows how many different reasons, but if they're going straight up, then it's like, we need to stop everything, get the kids.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
as much as if the kid's going sideways, like you need to stop everything and talk to him, but it's like, if you see, I had a friend growing up, he was like in his 30s and I was like 16, and I remember looking at his wrists and he told me why he had cuts, and they weren't sideways, they were straight up, and I was like,
Yeah.
the freakiest thing ever.
Yeah, you'll bleed out a lot quicker
He followed
if you hit the veins or the capillaries in that way, so the lethality is worse. But Drake, I want to, like, I feel safe with you. I want to, I do this tonight, you know, and I broke up with my girlfriend, and my uncle comes into my room every night, my mom's boyfriend, and they want to give you the story or whatever. And it could be the boy, you know, that, you know, my uncle comes in every night and that kind of stuff, and they want to go on with you. At what point do you set a limit and say, how would you set a limit with them? You want to be supportive, but you want to set a limit with them and get them some more help. What would that look like?
It's a tough situation. Personally, like I would set the limit at them wanting me to confront their uncle, or like I would let them talk to me, obviously, but like there's nothing I can do in that situation other than present myself to be the person that they can talk to about that. But also, like, I would want to bring that to somebody who can give them, like, professional help.
Yeah.
Or, like, I bring the story to the people who can give them professional help, because, like I said, I'm not in this situation. I don't know how to handle the situation in a way where it can actually help the kid other than being there for them.
Yeah, you validate and support, and you say, you know, you've given me a gift and trusting me with that. That's great. But, you know, we're out in the middle of the field sledding or something like that. We're going back up the sledding field. Thank you so much for trusting me with that. You know, that's so sweet. You've given me a gift that way. For right now, if they want to keep going like this, maybe they just want to, I like Drake. He's safe enough to talk to. We're going to kind of put that in a box and put that on the shelf right now. And we're going to get you some help on that kind of stuff. And we're going to follow up with that. But let's go back to dodgeball, or let's go back up, you know, and go sled and that kind of stuff. You validate, you move on, you give Donnie or Rochelle or Rob or whomever a heads up, kind of a thing. Has anybody else got a scenario that they might face, or I can keep throwing some stuff out at you, that kind of a thing? Yeah, you got one other?
Donnie's used to this situation, but one time Donnie and me were dropping someone off, and while we were dropping her off at this address, we realized that she was an underage. She was getting money for prostitution, and so, I mean, she's homeless, and so we were helping her, but that was a situation where I had no idea what to even do, because if you call, and a lot of times Donnie is the buffer in between CPS and just no CPS at all. In that scenario is kind of what he's saying, he doesn't really know what to do. But for me, that was the scenario that, like, we went through, we got through it, and I think about it later, but I mean, it was definitely pretty freaky all of a sudden picking up the girl, realizing what she had just done after you just dropped her off, and you're like how do you handle this next time? Do you just be the parent in that situation? And you just say, you know, you know, but then you lose the kid entirely because they just dip out of your radar and they're gone. So it's like, it's so situational, like I don't have an answer, and that was one that I still think about. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm glad that you and Donnie were together. Was she the last one that you were dropping off on that
She
particular
was-
night, or?
Remember that, Donnie? We were hanging out at the Jones place, and it was one of Molly's mentees, and India wanted to get dropped off.
Okay.
And we were like,
You know, that's being careful in that situation, because I've seen situations where Vice has got that staked out or something like that, and you get accused of being a John or soliciting, you know, that kind of stuff. That can get a little messy. So I'm glad that you guys had that. And what's tough is 16 is the age of consent. So I don't know how old this girl is,
She
but
was like 14. It was pretty rough. It was like, but that's kind of like one of the things that we get into is like, at a certain age, these kids are obviously doing stuff they shouldn't,
yeah,
and it's hard to know for us. And yeah, just how to, you can't really copy and paste situations, and there is kind of a learning curve. Like I was like 20, and it was just like, I don't know how you get around learning through that, you know, without making that mistake once. It's
Yeah.
not prevalent, but it's, you know, there's something similar.
thank you. Do you know what the concept of secondary trauma is?
Yes.
Is that, you want to,
Yeah, this is something that's
Sure,
very
about that?
real that I enter into each day. So when you're not particularly having something done to you, but you are either seeing or hearing something that someone else was going
it's
through.
okay if I get that so I can get it on the,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I should have thought.
This is actually, so it's something that you're hearing or seeing that is traumatic that person is going through, and you're taking that in and you're feeling that. That secondary trauma is, again, that you're not primarily the one in the situation, but you can sometimes get the effects of it because you're hearing it either consistently, or you're trying to help that person. I'm just like maybe you guys trying to help that person. So you're in that secondary position of being in almost like a stuck position of feeling, being hurt, and not always having a way out of that, but feeling the effects of it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate it. Something that's a really key point in that, and part of the reason I had you do this too, is if you're starting from a place where you got a score of 4 or more, and you're looking to serve kids that are in trauma, you've got to be aware of that, because when you see a 14-year-old go turn a trick, that kind of stuff, and that's the reality there, and you're put in this double bind where she's trying to survive, but she's being exploited and that kind of stuff. If you're starting out with a harder place, that's going to trigger you more. And let Rochelle, let Donnie know, you know, if this stirs that up there and you're on there, even if you're going into nursing, social work, psychology, or things like that, process that a little bit before you go into that, because you can lose objectivity as you get drawn into the stories and that. And what can happen is you're trying to fix, even if you're well-intended, you're trying to fix or heal your 10-year-old self by trying to fix this 14-year-old girl who's suffering and things like that, and it gets really mixed up, and you do a disservice to yourself and to that girl. So that's a great caution. Does that make sense, to just be aware of those things?
Can you explain objectivity?
Objectivity is I can't fully know someone's experience, and because this young man suffered physical abuse when he was 10 or whatever, I have to stand back and not assume that my experience was just like his. You know, the dynamics were some of the, I can have empathy to a degree, but there's so many different dynamics on there that I can't assume on that. And I make assumptions. I don't know what it was, you know, I don't know what it is for a 49-year-old white woman, you know what I mean? I can't, she was physically abused, I was physically abused when I was a kid. I can't put the expectations and prejudices and assumptions that I have, you know, onto her and that kind of stuff. I work with a lot of adult female trauma survivors of multiple races and different ages, and I don't know what it is to be 20 years old in 2021 either, you know, those kind of things. So I have to stand back on that, let them tell their stories, and avoid assumptions and prejudices and all that kind of stuff. I still have to make a judgment at some point and get them help or pick my spots, but that's kind of what objectivity means in a bigger picture. Anyone else have a scenario that they've seen or they wonder about? And that? Anyone else?
I think to give, I think this would be helpful for everybody. I think it's something that we can see. When you gain that trust, like you said, I've had that with a kid, and then that kid did open up about something that was being done at home. And I feel like it can be handled in sort of a similar situation like you were saying before. But that can also feel like a stuck situation, something where a parent is abusing, and then the next step is that. So I think it'd be helpful to go through an example like that, where a kid opens up to you about a parent that is abusing.
Yeah, there is, again, you know, validating that as much as you can. Moving that up the chain and saying, this is going on, you know, have Donnie, Rochelle, someone like myself that does some consulting work, you know, say, are we far enough along? Is a threat imminent enough where we need to do a CPS referral and all that kind of stuff? Now, that's kind of like the last resort. We want that to be the last resort. Sometimes building rapport with a family, getting to know that mom or that grandma or something like that is going to be essential. That's you make up a great point. Your mentee exists in a family system, and God can use you for that overwhelmed grandmother, that overwhelmed single mom, single dad sometimes that are doing that, to take a little bit of pressure off, and that can make a huge difference. What I love about the work that you're stepping forward to do in this is taking a little bit of the pressure off, giving a little bit of hope means, and sometimes with trauma, it's the cumulative effect. Trauma affects IQ points, and by giving someone hope, relieving stress for a given week, are they less likely to get into addiction? Are they less likely to have a psychotic break when they're 20 and those kinds of stuff? I really believe that what you're doing makes those critical kinds of differences, and that means the difference that they're independently employed the rest of their lives, or they're disabled with a chronic psychotic illness, they're bipolar the rest of their life, and they can't do that. When you give hope, you relieve that stress, you mitigate, you lessen some of the impact of these ACE scores, you're intervening in that. You talk to mom or grandma, you recognize her struggle, you're not looking to be high and mighty self-righteous, you remain objectivity, you have a sense of humility diving into that situation. I don't know what your lived experience is, help me understand that kinds of stuff. There will be points, it'll be rare, where Rochelle or Rob or Donnie jump in and they make the call. We got to file a 3200 report and get CPS involved, or call GRPD or something like that. That's rare. Working with those community resources, building trust in those systems, and you're a blessing and an example. You're showing how I can relate and communicate with that kinds of stuff. You've got younger siblings, you've got aunts that are checking that out. That really intervenes in that system. But thankful that's a great situation in that. What about, yeah, Drake, you got something?
How about if you're picking up a kid or dropping off a kid in a dangerous home setting, whether that's abusive parents or when you're dropping them off or picking them up, they're drunk or high, and what would you do in that situation?
There's a difference between, stepdad's got a bulge in his pocket because he's got his piece with him, and he's out of his mind and he's angry in some ways, or he's a silly drunk. You know what I mean? He's kind of whatever. That kind of. Your standard, my standard. I wouldn't want someone to supervise a child in that right of mind, but it's immediate threat, that kind of thing. And as a foster parent and going to foster care things, there's not a lot of beds out there. They can't find, for newborn babies that don't have special needs, they can't even find black, white, Latino, whatever. They can't find beds for them. And there really is a push right now to keep kids. There's historical prejudices where people are, for dubious cultural reasons or white middle class standards, you got to check all that stuff, and there's a recognition of some of those historical injustices. So the emphasis is in giving families and support and not pulling them. That's a big right thing. And practically speaking, there's not the foster care beds and that kind of stuff. There's going to be times when there's immediate threat and you get on your cell and you call non-emergency and call GRPD and have them come by in that situations. You talk to Rochelle or Donnie on in that situation, and you have to make a judgment call. But that's a great point, and that's sad, and you're sad for that kid, and you follow their lead. You kind of look for the non-language, because you can make the situation worse, and worse for them, worse for community kids' credibility in the community and things like that, and create all kinds of problems potentially. So thank you. I mean, that's a great point, how you negotiate that kind of thing. All right. What about the 16 to 17-year-old guy that you think he's selling? And he might have something on him. He's coming to an activity and he's got something in his backpack or in his pants or something like that.
Act shocked or like,
Yeah.
oh, it's the worst thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, that's.
I think these people know.
You already feel like a freak a little bit, that kind of a thing.
So you want to act like it's normal, but you also don't want them to think that you're not fazed by it and like, oh, you just told me that you just got abused all these times and like, oh, it's no big deal. So from your advice of, being in that situation, like what would have made you feel most loved?
Yeah, the key things in that's a great point, is kind of a matter of fact tone of voice, facial expression, that kind of thing. How can I help you? That kind of thing. Just leaving it off there is, but that's a good point. That the histrionic, hysterical, oh, poor Tim.
What you want to do inside is just punch something and be like, how could someone do this to you?
Yeah, you really have to.
Swear.
You really have to poker. Yeah, you have to poker face. In some ways, and you want to react like that, but kind of a matter of fact, supportive, neutral posture. How can I help is the most helpful thing. Drake, you got it.
Would sympathy almost be acceptable in that situation? Like, I'm sorry that's happening to you, but like, how can I help you? Like, how do you want me to help? Or is it just like straight?
Yeah, it's sometimes it can be. Sympathy is not always the best, because you never know. You can't know how much this sucks, honestly. But it's like, I'm sorry. How can I help? I believe you. That kind of stuff can go. If you start there, that'll get you a long way. A long way. So, no, great point. Excellent point. Yeah, sir.
I was kind of thinking like, so we talked about, you know, if a kid comes out and tells you something is going on, like straight up, but what can we be looking out for that may not be as obvious? Like that somebody may be a victim of abuse or, you know, depression or suicidal behavior that's not quite as obvious as them coming out and telling you. Like other behavioral patterns that as, you know, mentors we can be looking for in our kids, like just to be aware, because some people like hide that very well, and it just makes it hard sometimes to, you know, not leave people in the dust that are really hurting but aren't willing to, I guess, talk about it.
No, that's a good point. What is the classic dilemma as you're working with teens, young adults, is what's normal adolescent developmentally appropriate behavior, you know, mood swings, that kind of stuff, versus someone who's not verbalizing, they're experiencing trauma, but they're not verbalizing it. It's withdrawal, it's sudden dropping in grades, real personality changes, those kind of things. But what's really hard is, and why you need to consult or get some help on that kind of stuff, what is, I got into street drugs or something like that, you know, that kind of a thing. I got sucked into that whole situation. You know, sometimes that could be self-medicating to deal with the trauma and whatnot. But it's, you know, starting slowly, building that relationship. Do they make it? Are they withdrawing from? Withdrawal is the biggest thing. Isolating that kinds of stuff is the biggest thing. One of the classic things is approach avoid behaviors. You know, are they more fearful when you drop them off at uncle's house or grandma's house? You know, when they were like, oh, no big deal, or you know, somebody else's, you know, mom's got a new boyfriend or something like that, and there's an apprehension that you're 2 blocks from their place. You just look for patterns, and changes in those patterns would be the simplest way to approach avoid is kind of the classic psychological unconscious way to look at that. You know, more avoidance, you know, those kind of things, isolating. So great question, thank you. Anybody else? I know we could just do like semesters of class, you know, but you guys are already doing that. So consult. Be self-aware of what your trauma history is. If you're dealing with that, you're not trying to save those kids. Validate and consult. And thank you for fighting the good fight and serving the Lord in a tough situation.